Okay. As people are still hopping in, go ahead and pull up the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions that you want to get answered on this call, go ahead and put those in that question and answer box, and we'll get those answered for you. I first want to introduce myself. My name is Allison Gossard, and I am the marketing director here at CPPS. And we are so excited to have you on. We know that threat assessment and threat management is a huge topic currently today, and we hope to answer the questions that you guys have about this. I've got Randy Spivey here, our CEO for CPPS, and I've also got Dave Benson. He's our senior advisor and a certified threat manager. So it looks like we have people registered from every industry here. We've got business, education, healthcare, government. So I think we'll have a good varied questions that you guys are going to ask. So I'm excited to see that. First of all, Randy, if you just want to quickly introduce yourself, and if you can discuss what are some of the current societal trends that we're seeing in threat management today.
You bet. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on which side of the country you're on. It's a pleasure having a little time to visit with you all over the next 45 minutes to an hour. And hopefully we're able to answer any questions that you have. But we also want to set the stage with some of the things that we've seen evolve in the area of threat assessment and threat management over the last 10 years or so. I also want to take a little bit of a look at what's going on in our society and how that relates to threat assessment and the threats and how they're being posed and the frequency and what's causing them, and not to sensationalize what's going on in our country's environment, but just to take a realistic approach on the level of stress and things that folks are dealing with. So to start that, and then the other thing I want to start with is to talk a little bit about an interesting trend that we're starting to see in the area of a couple of cases in the last 60 days that the federal government has actually been sued and wound up having some large payouts, both for the Parkland, Florida shooting through the Department of Justice, and then yesterday being announced with the Department of Air Force being awarded or being told to pay a huge settlement from the shooting down in San Antonio, Texas, a couple of years ago. So I'm going to talk about those a little bit. But just to start, when we talk about threat assessment and violence prevention and organizations setting up a holistic program, it starts with understanding what are the concerns that are out there. And when we look at our current environment, in fact, Dave, one thing I was going to ask you, do you think things are going to have some resemblance of normalcy sometime in the next couple of months? It seems like every time we're doing one of these things, we're just getting crazier and crazier. So when I hand it over to you, I'll ask you your opinion on that. But hopefully, maybe we're starting to come on the back end of the last 24 months, which I think is fair to say. Most people, to one degree or another, have been dealing with certain levels of stressors and stress in America that is at a level that we've not seen happen, at least in my lifetime. And when we look at different things that would cause stress, from the political environment, from the last election to the protests on January 6th, to the follow-on of some people thinking that the election was stolen, to other people saying that's crazy, and all the ways in between. The economic environment started out with a lot of layoffs and huge levels of unemployment. Now we're almost to the other extreme in some degree, where you have labor shortages, and the services that people are used to getting are having difficulty getting that, which causes stress. Health and people's personal health and that of their family members. Just when you think you got the vaccine and you're getting on the back end of last summer of the pandemic, then this new Delta variant comes around and tends to be pretty significant, and then the newest version and the variant. So when people are dealing with their personal health, their finances, their jobs, the political environment, all those can be just sources of unprecedented levels of stress. And so one of the things we know about stress from a behavioral standpoint is that the more stress that people are under, for most people, there are a few exceptions to this, but for most people, the more piling on effect that you have of these different stressors, the more behaviors that you would start to see develop, whether it's in the workplace or just in society as a whole, of people acting out or progressing towards possibly becoming violent. And I call it a piling on effect, where, stress, and you put enough people under that, they have a hard time coping, and their coping skills begin to fade away and diminish, the more that they're likely to become violent or start on a process towards the exhibit behaviors that would indicate they could be heading towards violence. And I mentioned this in a prior webinar, but for those of you that weren't on, I talk about the difference between helplessness and hopelessness. Where helplessness is you put enough stress on people and different number of factors to where they feel like they're helpless. There's nothing I can do about it. But when they move into hopeless, where I not only cannot do anything about it, but it's never going to change. When people move into a mental state of hopelessness, then that's one of the things that really is a big red flag of people moving towards some real mental health issues and possible violence. So just a couple other data points. I was watching the news earlier today. I think it was yesterday, the Surgeon General came out and made a statement testifying before the Senate, I believe it was. And he says mental health is the new public health crisis. So, and he lists some statistics that we've talked about before, that particularly among the youth, the pandemic's been really difficult, but for everybody. And major clinical depression before the pandemic would have been up like 40 to 50% among the youth in America before the pandemic even hit. The American Psychological Association came out with a Stress in America, talking about in 2019, 2020, and 2021, what they're calling a national mental health crisis. So it's just been this piling on effect. And you start to see it manifested, the people's reaction or lack of coping skills, in things like everyday, I'm sure a lot of you do as well, but I travel a lot. And it doesn't seem like you go more than a few days and there's another news story of some person or groups of people acting out on the airplanes. In fact, I saw a report just the other day that there was one flight that was halfway across the Atlantic Ocean heading on, I think it was from New Jersey to Israel, and had to turn back. They're like 1,000 miles over the Atlantic Ocean, and they turned back because of unruly passengers. Murder rate in 2020, the highest increase in recorded history from the FBI, 30% increase. Aggravated assault up 12%. 100,000 drug overdose deaths between April of 2020 to April 2021. So what you see about these overdose and behaviors, that when you go from that helplessness to hopelessness, that's when people start to look at different ways to cope. And a lot of times that'll turn into addictive behaviors, or in the worst case can turn out to become violent. So I think it's fair to say then we talk about it, and the reason I bring that up is sometimes we'll have clients that are saying, well, we're still working from home, or we're on the things are getting better with the pandemic. Is it really necessary to have violence prevention programs and threat assessment programs in place now, or has the need for that gone down? And I think it's fair to say Dave and I would suggest not only is it needed, but it's probably needed more than ever. And Dave will talk about doing threat assessment in a virtual environment. There are some unique challenges with that, but certainly it's fair to say that it's needed and has not gone away. In fact, it's likely gone up. And so one of the other things that I mentioned, and I just wanted to highlight here, because I think it will have ramifications, not just for the government, but in civil liability and civil litigation. But in November, you had the FBI, basically, Department of Justice agreeing to pay the families and survivors from the Parkland, Florida high school shooting an award of $130 million because of gaps in the threat assessment process within the community, and where they highlighted there were two calls into their tip line in particular that they didn't properly follow up on. This is, their words. And one of them had to do with a woman calling in and saying, hey, I've watched this guy's Instagram account. He's bragging about collecting guns and ammunition, and I'm very concerned that he's going to walk into a school and shoot it up. I'm summarizing, but essentially that was one of the tips that got called in, and for whatever reason, didn't appear to be followed up on to the level that was needed, and resulting in a $130 million award to the survivors and family members. Then, like I said a minute ago, yesterday, the largest shooting in Texas history was at a church in San Antonio a few years ago. And the Department of the Air Force, it was a federal judge that ruled the Air Force failed to report this individual because he had a conviction of a domestic assault in which they should have let the FBI know that this was the conviction, and it fell through the gaps. They didn't do it. And this guy would have been prevented from buying the gun, the rifle that he used to do the shooting. And so the federal judge basically said, hey, you guys, because you didn't follow the protocols, you played a large role in the ability of this individual to get access to that weapon, and therefore I'm going to hold you liable to the tune of $230 million. And there were 26 people that were killed, a number more that were injured through that. But I've not seen this. We've seen civil litigation after these incidents. In fact, I've been involved in some court cases that have resulted in settlements or payouts, but nothing to that level, particularly when you're talking about a federal agency. And then Dave and I were just visiting on this right before we got on the webinar. I think one of the spin-off impacts of that in say the corporate world would be that there's been a bar set. There's kind of been a standard set now that the government was held liable. Here's something that in follow-on litigation, the attorneys are going to be referred back to as a reference point. So it just kind of struck me yesterday is, all right, 2 of these in the last 60 days from major cases, major incidents. And there was a shooting at a school up in the Midwest, upper Midwest. I don't remember exactly where it was at, but basically they're accusing that the school had warning signs that this individual that did the shooting, the parents actually were arrested because of their potential or possible role in the shooting that took place. So watch that case. I think that'll be interesting to see what happens with that one as the courts play out, both from a criminal liability and then civil liability as we go down the road. So with that, I'm not trying to be gloom and doom, but a lot of good things going on right now. But the environment that we're operating in and working in is still pretty tense. A lot of things that would lend itself towards violence progressing, and I think you're seeing that happen not just in the workplace, but in society. And so, and that's really when we talk about threat assessment and violence prevention, it's more than just in a workplace type environment. This is a societal issue, and I'll let Dave visit on that a little bit more. So, Dave, first of all, do you think we're getting closer to getting normal in it right now, or?
Well, yeah. Thanks for the tough question right out of the box, Randy. I mean, I think it depends on what you define as normal.
Yeah.
I think we are evolving. We are coping. Trying to meet the challenges that we've all been up against. And, when you talked a little bit about trends and societal trends, it is finding itself into the violence prevention world. So, for example, I just did a very short video on LinkedIn a while back where for the lack of a better term, I discussed weaponized speech and how difficult it is nowadays to separate whether it be political, medical, societal, situational speech from hate speech. So that's number one. Number two, some of the visceral dialogue that we're seeing, regardless of which side you are in any particular spectrum, is only raising the anxiety of people that are already anxious. And so for the small portion, but significant group of people that find it difficult to cope with life's challenges, it's a real opportunity for them to lash out. And so I would argue that while the threats have morphed and they've changed, but the principles stay the same. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. Behavioral threat assessment, it adapts, and it has over a period of time. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But the fundamental tenets of behavioral threat assessment really haven't changed. And you have to keep that in mind with some of these, pretty awful things that are being said.
Well said, Dave.
I agree. I think two things that you guys both pointed out that are super valuable are that organizations are being held liable for this. So that means you've got to have something in place. And also that there are trends, and it is a climate where threats are increasing and enhancing, and we need to be prepared for that. So thank you. Dave, can you discuss the background and the progression of threat assessment?
I will, and I promise the audience, many of you know I'm a retired diplomat, so I could go on for days. I won't do that with you. I'll give you the Reader's Digest version, but really the timeline or the progression or the evolution of behavioral threat assessment is an interesting one. And it's not that old of one. 20, 30 years wasn't long ago that people thought that violence prevention was nice to have. We used to talk about that we have things like sexual harassment that still is a problem today, and other issues, but having comprehensive programs to discern the likelihood of violence and then to come up with appropriate intervention strategies really wasn't thought. As a matter of fact, I cut my teeth as a retired diplomatic security agent with the State Department, and any of the former or current Secret Service folks out there remember the term PII, Protective Intelligence and Investigation. And part and parcel of that was, in fact, threat assessment, behavioral threat assessment, based upon a specific event or a specific protectee or individual. And so that was primarily where that was practiced. And over time, out of necessity, sadly, it has evolved for schools, houses of worship, corporate America, faith-based, other faith-based organizations, nonprofits, whatever it might be. The fact of the matter is, no sector is immune from the potential of targeted or intentional violence. And that's really what we're talking about here. And certainly from about 1998 onward, with the that seminal event that we knew as Columbine, and while it affected exclusively an educational institution, a school, it had rippling effects, and we're still feeling it now. It begot a lot of different studies and concepts, and why people think the way they do, why they behave that way, and is there a way to assess? The word is not predict. We're not predictors. To assess the likelihood of violence given a set of circumstances. And so that really is the essence of behavioral threat assessment. By the time we got to the tragedy in Virginia Tech, we had another watershed moment. And then we had Sandy Hook, and it just goes on. And that's just on the education side. So corporations have had more than their share of mass shootings and significant events. And one of the things that we learned in this process, and when Randy and I first got together, seems like a long time ago, Randy, we realized there has to be a connection between the way people behave and what the likelihood is that they might actually harm somebody. Maybe a small percentage of the people that we look at, and I look at every day in my consultancy, have the capability, wherefore to do that. But almost everybody starts with the same behaviors of concern, right? And that's why a comprehensive workplace violence prevention program is absolutely critical. So behavioral threat assessment is not a separate thing. If you have that as part of your threat management group, but it's not connected in some way, with your workplace violence prevention and intervention program, you need to connect it. They are attached at the hip. It's a symbiotic relationship in that regard. And it's continuing to grow and to change, not only in popularity, but with organizations like ATAP, the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, of which I'm certified as a certified threat manager. That's the whole mission of the organization, is to expand, to grow, and to teach the values of behavioral threat assessment.
You know, Dave, and you mentioned there a couple of key incidents and seminal moments in the area of this violence prevention and having to do threat assessment to prevent these active shooter incidents. You know, the whole issue of training people to respond to an active shooter incident, that hasn't been around that long. In fact, when you go back to Virginia Tech, the Virginia Tech shooting, basically there was no run, hide, fight. There was no guidance in the United States on what to do in an active shooter situation. And I remember watching the after action report of that particular incident, and because the history of the folks that started CPPS had come out of the FBI and Department of Defense and State Department and training people to deal with extreme situations, we had a lot of training on how to train people how to do it in a hostage situation. And so that had been going on for decades. But now the question was, how do you change that? Do you change it? And what could you do to train people for an active shooter? In other words, and the reason that was important was because if somebody walks into an office or into a classroom and pulls out a gun, how do you know in the first first few seconds, is this going to be an active shooter or is it going to be a hostage situation? And this came up just a couple of weeks ago with the hostage scenario in the synagogue here in Texas, in Colleyville, Texas. And so what we recognize is that the guidance that we thought through it, and we brought together some former bureau and military folks and sat around the table and said, you know, this is what you do in a hostage situation. You be calm, you follow their directions and try and get negotiated out. If you do that with an active shooter, you're gonna get killed. And so we've actually reversed the guidance, and that's where the very first training program came out called Shots Fired. Of basically, that was the formation of run, hide, fight. You got to take action, you got to assess, and you got to take an action immediately, even though initially you may have to figure out, is this active shooter or a hostage scenario? You have to assess that threat on an individual level when you're in the moment. And so prior to 2007, that didn't exist. That came out in late 2007 and then was followed up by, you know, some of the government guidance a few years later.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we now understand that this is a combined process. To have a robust program, you have to have all those capabilities. And not only that, for those situations that might be above everybody's pay grade, and they happen on occasion, you need to have that outside expert or outside resource to be able to assess, you know, to help you with that. Because after all, the goal is, it's information driven, right, Randy? So the information comes in. What are you going to do with the information? First of all, do you report it? How do you report it? Who do you report it to? That's the essence of workplace violence prevention. But then what can you expect organizations to do with that information? Are they going to take a responsible approach? What's the difference between making a threat versus posing a threat? And the short answer is anybody can make a threat. Talk is cheap. It doesn't mean we don't pay attention to it, but if it's followed up with other behaviors of concern, planning behavior, targeting behavior, all these sorts of things that could lead onto the pathway of intentional or targeted violence, you have to have that capability. And then the final piece is, what are you going to do to stop it, to mitigate it, maybe make it go away, but that's not always realistic. But what are you going to do to put together as what we call intervention strategies? And these are things that organizations should already know ahead of time that they have available based upon their resources. So everything is kind of all combined together, whereas once upon a time it was, we did this and then we did that.
Yeah.
I see a question coming in. Are we going to be sharing any slides or media after this call? And I just wanted to quick touch on that. We will be sending next week a FAQ PDF download that you are able to download and read the answers to any questions that were asked and any additional questions as well. So you both have touched on the connection between threat assessment and your workplace violence prevention and intervention programs. Is there anything that you would like to add to just dive in a little bit deeper to that connection?
Well, one thing that, and Dave touched on this already, but I just reinforce it a little bit, is that, when we work with an organization to set up the holistic program, you have to, they're both pieces have to work together in order for the program to work. In other words, for example, the Parkland school shooting, you had somebody that recognized a warning sign, they reported it, but then something fell apart, and on the threat assessment side and the follow-up, something went wrong. So you could have people are trained on what to look for and actually do the reporting. But then, as Dave mentioned, if the organization isn't diligent and trained and equipped to be able to respond to whatever that concern is, then you have a problem. On the reverse side of that is you could have a really robust capability of threat assessors and expertise and people that know how to go through the process that Dave was talking about. But if you have an employee, or in the case of a school, a student sees something, hears something, but then doesn't say something, they won't know. They won't have the tools to be able, or the data to be able to do the assessment on. And so both parts have got to be functional and operating. And I think one of the things that a good program will have in place is a level of confidence among those that are either in the school or in the corporation that says, if I see something and I step out, that I have a high level of confidence that whoever I'm reporting this to is going to do something about it. That it's going to be taken seriously. Hopefully the system's in place to where I'm not going to be vulnerable as a person who's stepping forward, because that's one of the inhibitors of people coming forward, is there could be retaliation or retribution coming against them. And so the whole program has to be solid, from your policy to training all your employees on what are the warning signs and here's how you report it when you see it, to enhanced training for the managers and supervisors that says, and oftentimes when we're dealing with large companies or government agencies, this is the weakest link, is that the manager has not been trained on either how to say, this is potentially serious enough that I need to put it to the threat management team and report it to them, or they have something that maybe on a scale of 1 to 10 is about a 5 as far as intensity and problematic, but they've not been trained on how to de-escalate it and intervene, so it winds up becoming worse. They go in there and they kind of blow it up because of their poor communication skills. So that's why the manager level has to be trained on how to assess to a basic level and then intervene to a de-escalation level. And then, of course, then you have to form your threat assessment team and do training for them regularly and have that expertise that Dave's talking about. So, I don't know the best analogy for that, Dave, but essentially you got to have the gas and the engine. I mean, either one's missing, you're not going to go anywhere and you could have problems.
No, I think that's a good analogy. And another thing I'd like to highlight, this really needs to be a multidisciplinary approach. Yes, I'm a certified threat manager, and I will help you, and my colleagues around the country that do the same thing will help you. But all of us will tell you that you're much better with a rounded group of people that look like your organization, that respect, that represent the different disciplines. And obviously the core group is legal and security or loss prevention, maybe facilities, corporate communications, lots of different components for each group or each organization, but it's essential because you're absolutely better together. That's number one. Number two, you have to be trained together. And that doesn't mean that if you go out and get threat assessment training by some of the fine providers in the country, that's awesome. But you come back as one person that's gone through the training. What about the rest of your 6, 7, 8, 10 colleagues that are helping assess the likelihood of violence within your organization? So training a team is critically important. The dynamics are very different. And then you do have that luxury, or that, not luxury now, it's a necessity of having an outside expert if necessary to do that. But that's an absolutely critical a component, is that, and the the compliance documents, the ASIS, original American National Standard, and then now the International Standard on Workplace Violence Prevention, not only says it's a good idea, it says you should. And tying into what happens if, despite our best efforts, we have some kind of potential act of extreme violence, that has to be part of the process too. So there really isn't any breaking it down. It's readiness, that response piece, and then recovery.
And I was on a call just the other day with a security professional up in Minnesota, and he was sharing with me the problems that they deal with on a regular basis and not working together as that team that David's talking about. They have somebody in HR that will hear something, and maybe they're working towards a termination, and they get towards the termination date, and all of a sudden they call security and say, hey, this considers to be a high risk termination. And now, they're not talking together, and they aren't operating together, let alone being trained together. And one of the things that I've seen when Dave does this training, it's so effective in breaking down some of these silos, because you bring them all to the table and they're able to say, okay, we can work together better as a team rather than individually, because there are things that all of us are bringing to the table collectively. 1 + 1 = 4. And so we've seen that happen over and over as part of that threat assessment process.
I think another thing to mention is that I think I'm a big proponent, and Randy, I know you are from your days with the Air Force and the early days of CPPS, of scenario-based and vignette training. Mm-hmm. There's no substitute for practicing. You can learn the curriculum, you can crank it out and think you're really knowledgeable, but if you've never worked a case, or particularly if you've never worked a case as a team, you're just not going to be as effective. So it's reinforcing that muscle memory, that behavior is somewhat quantitative, all right? It's not a predictor. I'm going to talk about the difference between profiling and threat assessment in a little bit, but we do know that certain behaviors over a period of time and clusters of behaviors require some concern and some analysis and what we're going to do in those situations. Basic stuff, someone that's misbehaving or having a personal problem at home, to major things. And we know that it builds. And what we don't want to do is have someone get on that pathway to intentional or targeted violence, and we've missed those signs and symptoms. And it does happen.
So, Dave, actually, I think now is a great time, since you started in on that. Let's talk about that difference between profiling and behavioral threat assessment.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm really glad we all decided in preparation for this that we would have it, because I still hear it. Profiling is kind of a sexier word, and we see it on TV. And it's not that it's not effective, but it's effective for certain things. And we'll talk about that. So first of all, threat assessment is the antithesis of profiling, all right? Threat assessment involves an individual assessment of a person of concern in a particular situation at a particular point in time. It's almost always fact-based, and it's deductive in the reasoning, dynamic and responsive to the nature of and process of a threatening situation. So really, I often tell my clients, behavioral threat assessment, if I provide you with a soup to nuts threat assessment, it's only as good as 2:35 today, Eastern time, absent more information. It's that dynamic process. And that's why it's so effective. It will assess the likelihood of violence. It will not predict it. Profiling, on the other hand, oftentimes deals with certain types of criminals, certain types of criminal activity. There are certain types of crimes that tend to be effectively dealt with via profiling. Serial crimes, they do them over and over and over again. But anyway, it's making generalizations about an individual based upon their similarity to others on high-risk groups. It's very inductive. And so in behavioral threat assessment, we're not going to be able to tell you we're looking at a white male, 35 to 40 years old, lives at home with mom, has probably been dishonorably discharged from the military, all those things. That is profiling. And while it's effective for certain things, not only do I say so, but the Bureau's Behavioral Assessment Unit says so. And when they deal with targeted and intentional violence, they do not profile. They practice what we call BTAM, behavioral threat assessment. One shout out I'd like to put in there is the useful FBI's pamphlet came out in the last few years calling Making Prevention a Reality. It really goes into a lot of these things to keep it consistent.
Sorry, could you say that again? I'm having trouble hearing you.
So apparently that was Siri that didn't like my answer on my phone. So I'm gonna silence her. Gotta love live webinars.
Yes, indeed. You know, Dave, one thing that I'd add on to this whole threat assessment discussion before we go into more of the Q&A, and thank you for helping to clarify the difference between profiling and behavioral threat assessment, because we get asked that question a fair amount, or people will assume one or the other, and people say, well, no profiling, but they don't really understand the difference. And so I appreciate you clarifying that. But one of the things that sometimes I will hear clients say is, or ask, do I need to have a dedicated threat assessment team? Can it just be done by, security and HR as they need to? Or, what's the difference between our crisis management team and our threat assessment team? And you've touched already about the value of training together, but can you just touch a little bit about why it's important that they have a threat assessment team, why it's in the national standard that you've got to have it, you've got to train them regularly and periodically. It's really not an option if you're going to follow the guidance that's in these documents.
Yeah, absolutely. And really the key word here to this entire discussion today is behavior, whether it's workplace violence prevention or behavioral threat assessment. Threat assessment or threat management teams, or whatever you want to call yourself, deal with human behavior. Crisis management, in its more traditional sense, deals with the likelihood of how we're going to respond when things occur. Natural disasters, emergencies. Granted, if a violent situation is not caught, it can become a crisis. But the point is, when you're dealing with human beings, we have to pay a lot closer to attention. It requires specific training and understanding the nature of how people tend to behave in certain situations, the environment, what stress has done or might do to them under the circumstances. And that helps us determine if in fact we might have a potential threat that that's posed, as opposed to just make that threat.
Great, thank you.
That's good, thank you. Okay, so we are going to dive into some of the questions that you guys have asked. If you haven't asked anything yet, feel free to jump into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen and get your questions answered. The first one we have is from Kate. Do you think there's a benefit to having a multifunctional discussion, even if threats have been mitigated and/or employees are denying assistance in the ways of EAP, time off, safety, consultation, etc.?
Randy, I'll take that if you don't mind. The short answer is absolutely, because all the things that you've spoken of should be part of a comprehensive program. Those are mitigation strategies. And just because we've been able to alleviate, and oftentimes that's the case with lower level behaviors, we're able to mitigate or alleviate a concern. That doesn't mean that concern goes away. That doesn't mean we put a case file and put it in the drawer and never look at it again. One of the things we know is that over time, things can change and it can rear its head again. And so it needs to be periodically addressed. So There's a place for discipline. There's a place for EAP. EAP, it should be a critical partner in a threat management team program, but it's comprehensive. We need to take a look at everything in that. And just because we dodged the bullet, perhaps a poor choice of words this time, that doesn't mean we won't down the road. Because again, behavior is quantifiable. If you don't get at the source, it's going to appear again.
Great. Kate also added, how can user and entity behavioral analytics provide benefit to threat assessment efforts? She says it may be a loaded question, so if there's any low-hanging fruit, that would be helpful to know.
Yeah, as workplace violence prevention programs have begun to mature, and as part of that, threat management, threat assessment and threat management, the desire for analytics has become more and more important. But here's the problem. If you don't have a program, if you don't track your incidents, if you don't have a way to determine or decipher what those trends are, you don't have anything to go on. So raw statistics you have to be careful of. But if you can show that you've had so many events of a certain type within a year or within a calendar year, and of those you were able to mitigate 50, 60% of those. And again, you don't have to violate confidentiality. Those are the kind of analytics that can be very helpful. The problem is most workplace violence prevention programs are not yet mature enough to be able to do that. So I say analytics is the future, and we're striving for that. So as frustrating as it can be, particularly in the healthcare industry, my colleagues say, show me the analytics, show me the analytics. Well, it has to combine all situations. Like for the longest time in healthcare, they focused only on emergency room events. Well, that skews the data. So again, within your own organization, and being able to track and securely and confidentially maintain the information helps you with that analytical piece and moving forward as to what works and what's not. Hopefully that answered the question.
You know, one thing on the analytical side, or the analytics, you know, we've worked with a large number of big insurance companies, and some of them are starting to actually underwrite policies for active shooter and underwrite policies for organizations on workplace violence. And a common question will come up is, well, if I get the training, or if I do training for the employees, can I get a discount on my policy that we're insuring through you? And when we've talked to the underwriters, what they've said is essentially what Dave said. First of all, we don't have a lot of actuarial tables and ability to go in there and see the data. They're not mature enough. They said, but I'll tell you what, if we love certifications and we love things that are structured. So if we have two companies that we're getting ready to underwrite one of these policies, and one of them has a program in place and the other one doesn't, the premiums are going to be higher for the one that doesn't, even though they won't say it. You know, they won't come out and say how much difference it is. They said that's actually how they go about determining risk and determining the policy premiums in these kind of cases. So it's something that I think as they get more data, they might be able to, you know, pour more analytics to that. But right now, it still makes a difference.
Good. I have another one for you, Dave. You mentioned you're not a predictor, but an assessor. Prediction sounds like risk assessment. Can you describe the difference between risk assessment and threat assessment?
Yeah, that's another great question. Thanks so much for bringing that up. So in a nutshell, risk assessment is a process where you try to quantify the likelihood that a certain event will take place. Okay? And so sometimes it's numerical, sometimes there's other formulas, but you want to be, and I run into this with clients sometimes, where they'll say, we want to know how likely we are to have a workplace violence incident in our organization. Sadly, because of the behavioral nature, while we want you to have a robust program, you're just as likely to have an event. You're just going to be better equipped to manage it and deal with it. So you cannot predict an act of intentional violence before it happens. We can be able to assess based upon the information and the facts and the planning behavior and targeting that likelihood, which is why we try to put it on a hierarchy of what we call dangerousness. I teach low, medium, and high. But again, there's no prediction there. And it will change based upon the information that you have and what you don't have. And so risk assessment is really more of an academic process. It's important, and it certainly helps you determine where you're going to put your budgets. But you can do your best to inhibit an act of violence, but you can't guarantee it won't happen, let alone where it will happen.
Great. We've got one here from Mike. It seems like the new political and social battlefield is the local school board. School board members are getting bombarded with threats and hateful messages about mask policy, book censorship, critical race theory, and other issues. Can you talk about the duty of care issues and how authorities should address these rampant threats?
Well, I'll touch on that, and then I'll let Dave dig into it deeper. But, you know, when we talk about violence prevention, there's internal threats, there's external threats. And, you know, if you're in a public environment, this could be, you know, whether it's a political rally, a board meeting, a city council meeting, and you have people that are coming in with the intent to disrupt, you do have a duty of care obligation to make sure that those that are involved and in the positions are protected and have a program in place to be able to mitigate and keep the peace inside that environment. More recently, like you're saying, Mike, the school board meetings are a hot spot, but we see this, you know, political rallies, protests, you know, all kinds of different public gathering events in which the threats can manifest themselves into actual violent behavior. And so I'll let Dave talk about the specifics on how to de-escalate that. But one of the things that I find is that sometimes, particularly if they're coming in with a legitimate concern and they're trying to express it rather than just incite violence and anger. If they're there just to incite, well, you know, you got to get them out of there. But if they're there to actually try and make a point or to express an opinion, and those that they're talking to downplay it, basically say you don't have a right to be expressing that opinion, or you're overreacting, basic de-escalation principles that they violate. This is an example of what I was talking about earlier with managers. You can take something that somebody on a scale of 1 to 10 is about a 5, but through improper training and intervention, they make it into an 8, just because they're invalidating the person that's trying to express themselves. So that's different than somebody who's coming in there is trying to incite the meeting itself. But I see a lot of times people say really dumb things. You know, somebody's trying to express what they're feeling, and they just get shut down, and it just escalates unnecessarily.
Yeah, I would add to that. It's kind of a three-legged stool. Understanding within an organization, and school boards or organizations, what are some of the threats you need to be concerned with? What are some examples? And then through policy, procedure, and protocols, how are you going to respond to those, right? And then there's the communications piece. What are you going to say? And when we see these things go awry, organizations, in this case, maybe a school board, were unprepared, surprised about what was said, and not prepared to either verbally deal with it, organizationally deal with it, and then if need be, bring in some safety and security support. So, you know, this is critical. I talked about this in a conference just last week. You have to assume these things are going to occur, ladies and gentlemen, not hope that they don't, and then respond to them when they do. Assume it's possible, determine what resources you have and how you might be able to mitigate that, and then finally, how you're going to respond and react. And it changes depending on the environment. And so I agree with Mike that it is certainly a social battlefield now, but it's not just there. It's communities, it's churches, it's you know, neighborhoods, and so we all have to get a handle. And Randy, you made a great point. People don't have to be right or wrong. That's not your job. But we need to learn to respond in a civil way that does not make a bad situation worse. So training I mean, most of these school boards don't have that kind of training. And
No,
they
they
certainly don't have de-escalation training. And they certainly don't have enough time put together with programs how to respond with those sorts of things. I mean, I know my friend and colleague, Rick Parfit, is on this call, and that's what he does at Lee County Schools. And I know they have a program, and they've gone through some rough patches with the public and dealing with that. But you've got to have a plan, and you've got to be prepared to deal with it and not be surprised when it occurs.
And I think that from a duty of care perspective, that term foreseeable risk, you know, that this is going to happen in this environment. And so any organization or a school board meeting nowadays, it's an obvious foreseeable risk that this thing's going to become tense. And if you don't have a program in place, so you don't have a plan in place, and that training component that, you know, Dave mentioned, and then violence happens, bam, you know, you just open yourself up to some real problems.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, so if you haven't entered your question yet, please go ahead and add that down to the Q&A box. I've got another one here. When a historical period of no incident affects an organization's ability to be vigilant enough to plan, what are some ways you've seen success in refocusing decision makers' efforts to prepare their organization?
Yeah, Randy, if you don't mind, I'll jump on that. It really is an overarching plan. When you're successful, doesn't mean you let your guard down, right? And that's what we're talking about here. So you've had some success, or what I'm fond of saying, too many organizations across the board don't know what they don't know because they don't have policies, procedures, training, and plans in place. Just because things have gone well, whatever that means, because that means the potential can go bad at just about any time, doesn't mean it won't rear its head again. And so you have to have those things in place, like a threat management group, a skilled HR team, your security folks, all these things to be on the lookout for the signs, because much of this is cyclical and nothing stays these days the same forever. So you really have to have that comprehensive plan to look at the readiness, how ready you can be, how you're going to respond if it happens, and how does an organization recover once they have a catastrophic event. And you really can't separate one from the other, in my view.
And one trend that I've seen occur over the last probably 18 to 24 months, well, actually a little bit before the pandemic even started, was that because these violent incidents in the workplace and just, you know, Walmart or a church or a school, they're happening with enough consistency that what I'm finding that, you know, in 2007, when we put out shots fired and you had security folks who were trying to go into HR departments and say, hey, we need to do active shooter training. You know, they would just get shut down and say, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to scare our people, or we don't want to take on liability. But what's happened over the last 15 years is that so many incidents have happened and there's so much publicity around it. And now court cases actually tying monetary judgments against these incidents, is that I'm finding that companies C-suites and CEOs and the board of directors are coming to the CEO in their board of directors meetings saying, what are we doing to take care of our employees, and what are we doing to prevent these active shooter incidents from happening, and keep this from, help us respond if it does. You know, the CEO then comes down to the HR department and the security department saying, hey, what are we doing for our people? And it used to be the security folks going up and trying to push it uphill. And there still is that to a certain degree, but I've seen more and more where it's coming from the top down, and which makes it easier to say this is a program just like sexual harassment or other compliance programs that we put into place, that it's mandated, it's recurring, and it's institutionalized. Right. And this is not something that's optional. You don't get a video on how to prevent violence and throw it on your intranet and say, okay, we have a program in place. You know, that doesn't cut it. And some companies do that, but the best practices ones are going to say, no, this is, you know, we do initial training, we do recurring training, we do it at different levels. We have the threat assessment capability and expertise and a team, and we just have this holistic package. And it's that holistic package that becomes effective. And you miss any one of those components, and, you know, it's like the transmission falling apart in the car. So, or the ability for that to happen. So that's what I've seen as far as trying to, if you haven't had an incident, but there's enough incidents happening in society that it's in the psyche. In fact, I mentioned the American Psychological Association study and what causes people stress in America. The number one source in 2019, before the pandemic, of stress on the average American, according to APA, were mass shootings. Mass shootings was the number one source. And it was when during the pandemic, it was number two, following their personal health care. So, it's on people's minds, it's causing people stress. The leaders know it's a concern. And so when it's offered, not just, okay, we just have a threat assessment team, or we just have an active shooter video, but a holistic package in which you have the policies, the different layers of training, and the threat assessment protocols and teams and training. Now that makes sense. They get it and they say, okay, I have not heard, maybe more than once, but I'm not sure I've heard it once in doing this now for almost 20 some odd years, that when it's approached that way, that somebody goes, that just doesn't make sense. Or I don't see the value in that. There's just too much violence happening. So approach them with the holistic package, and the threat assessment being a key part of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we have to continue to adapt and to morph and to change and respond to changing threat environments. And so, to kind of, from my perspective, Randy, to bring this plane in for a landing, this is not nice to have stuff that we're talking about. Those days are over with. They're essential. And we have to continue to get better. And are we going to catch them every time? No, we're not. But we'll catch a lot more with this approach that we've talked about today. And you can make a huge difference in people's lives and organizational lives. We can stop a lot of this. We really can, if you put these procedures in place.
Well said. And, Allison, thank you for facilitating today's session. You did a great job. And Dave, thank you for providing all of our subject matter expertise in this area. And I know you just came off of your ATAP conference down in Florida. That was a huge success. And I just want to close by mentioning that, we have a few questions we didn't get to, so we're going to put together that FAQ and answers to those, and then we'll send those out. And I also want to let everybody know that you're going to get an email that will give you a little information. We actually have an online threat assessment training program that lasts about 5 hours, that goes through much of what we would do if we came on site and in person. And it's great training for individuals, it's great training for teams. And then what we do oftentimes is, let's say your corporation, you have 10 members of your team, you put them through the online training, and then we do a follow-on session with several hours of those tabletop exercises that are facilitated live by Dave. And so we're happy to share more about that with you. I think we're offering a discount on the online course here, and it'll be in the email that follows. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions. We're happy to follow up with you at any part of your program so you think could use some help, and appreciate everybody doing their role to keep us safe in this crazy world that we're in. And certainly the things we talked about today play a part of that. So thank you very much. And thank you, Allison.
Thank you. And just before you guys head out, I just wanted to mention next month, March 9th, we will be having another one of these webinars, and we will actually be discussing our Safe Workplace certification and taking that tiered approach to a holistic violence prevention program. So be watching your emails for an invite for that as well.